Joining us to continue that conversation is Richard Mamabolo, who is the Popcru spokesperson. Richard, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And just to get your immediate reaction as Popcru when you heard those crime stats that were released earlier today.
Good evening to you and the listeners. Look, we're not quite surprised by the crime statistics. I think on a year-to-year basis, we've been seeing increases and decreases of crime statistics. But what is more concerning has been the fact that, the decreases and increases have not been over 10 to 20%, but they've been rather limited. I think one of the challenges that it poses is then to the extent to which police are able to actually look into these crime statistics and actually deal with them. So one of the reasons why we moved away from, the SAPS rather moved away from announcing crime statistics on a yearly basis to a quarterly basis was we had hoped to ensure that they would obviously be aware of certain trends as quick as possible so that they could deploy more resources towards those areas. And just to remind you, when the President of the Republic in his sixth administration State of the Nation address communicated to the country, it stated that we need to have violent crimes within a period of 10 years. And that has not been happening. And that was obviously due to the fact that there were budget cuts since the time of Mboweni. So we think that part of the problem has been the uneven allocation of resources to police stations, especially those which are based in townships and rural areas. And that is, of course, due to the lack of funding that has been allocated in those areas. So with the new minister, of course, there are plans to look into how we can actually deal with this challenge of crimes. But it's not only something which should be isolated to police alone. We need to work with communities. Last year, we had a policing endeavor where we looked into factors which we think we can actually have joint ventures with businesses and communities to look into how we can deal with these challenges. So it's going to be quite important that moving onwards, the new minister and, of course, the operational person who is the commissioner need to work together to ensure that we address these matters. And, of course, part of the challenges that we have also identified in dealing with this matter is that, police can only deal with certain aspects of crime. They can only bring people before the court. So you need to also have the judiciary actually communicating as to how many people have been prosecuted or not. And out of those who have been prosecuted, we need to obviously as well know how many people enter our correctional facilities. So these announcements of crime statistics should be a joint venture between the judiciary, the police, of course, and the Department of Correctional Services. We believe that will give us a clearer picture around what actually needs to happen, and it will actually as well speak to the budgetary commitments that need to be taken into account when dealing with all these aspects.
Yeah, there's a few things I just want to pick up on that you've mentioned there, Richard. Of course, also the under-resourcing of police stations, but also particularly in townships. I mean, when one thinks of like in Inanda, in KwaZulu-Natal, where there's one police station there, and that's supposed to service just over 158,000 people. Now, if we know that these are the concerns already, why do you think we're still seeing these budgetary cuts?
Yeah, look, I think, despite the government taking positions around what should happen, the challenge has always been around the finance ministry dictating as to what budget allocations go to which areas. And I think, of course, as much as there might be budgets allocated to the SAPS, there needs to obviously be some form of internal observations as to which areas need to be prioritized. The mere fact that you've got statistics being communicated on a quarterly basis should actually be an indication as to look into which areas need to be focused on. I think for the past 2 years or so, we have had these quarterly crime statistic releases, and yet in most cases you've had Inanda as well being one of the worst areas affected. So that then demonstrates that as much as there would be information around which areas to target, yet there has not been sufficient action taken. And that can only speak to the budgetary allocations. So it's an important factor that needs to be considered in the future. And we hope that the new minister will take it up at a legislative level. Of course, we've also made other proposals around revisiting the Criminal Procedure Act and of course ensuring that the killing of police officers as well, which is another challenge, becomes considered as treasonous.
And speaking of the killing of police officers as well being a challenge too, for the police officers, men and women in blue who have their boots on the ground as well, they are outnumbered in many of the instances by these criminals as well, which again speaks to the budget constraints, the budget cuts. If we had more people, more resources, we could probably be able to tackle this better. When you speak of the synergy between the criminal justice cluster, or the lack thereof, one that needs to be there, we've seen and heard the president before calling on harsher sentencing when it comes to matters of GBV, for instance. Now we're hearing him talk about harsher sentencing when it comes to extortion crime as well. But then does that even trickle to the judicial system? Do we then see those things taking place following the president calling on that?
Yeah, you see, it's one thing to make a call and one thing to implement again. I think because the president has been making some progressive calls in the past, and yet you've got certain functionaries within government who actually will play a role which leads to some of the commitments that the president makes not being fully realized. And just like I indicated about having violent crimes within a decade. So some of these things have got to do a lot with budgetary constraints. I think one of the things that definitely needs to be looked into is to obviously ensure that the synergy within the criminal justice cluster is prioritized. And of course, I think, we have been engaged with the former minister and the current national commissioner. Well, what we are hopeful of is that, we've also been hearing some good commitments from the Minister of Correctional Services. So hopefully there will be such an encounter wherein there would be further engagement. And such engagements should not only happen where there are potential crisis areas in the country, just like we had back in the time when you had the uprisings, but it should be a constant thing that will obviously as well inform how these different clusters within the criminal justice sector cooperate.
Richard Mamabolo, thank you so much for your time this evening. That's the Popcru spokesperson, Richard Mamabolo, just commenting and reacting to those crime statistics that were released today.